Kasserine Pass, Tunisia. February 1943, somewhere past 3 in the morning. The temperature has dropped hard enough that the rock under a German reconnaissance officer's elbows feels like ice. He lies flat, field glasses raised, watching a line of American soldiers move through a minefield his own engineers laid 4 nights earlier. He knows this field. He drew the diagram himself in ink back at battalion headquarters. Teller mines buried at staggered intervals along the wadi floor, tripwires strung low across the gaps, a pattern built from years of hard-won German mine warfare doctrine and designed to kill anything that tried to cross it in the dark. The Americans are not detonating anything. They move slowly, almost lazily, one man out front sweeping something back and forth just above the dirt. Behind him, a line of soldiers steps exactly where he has already stepped, boot for boot, like men following chalk marks only they can see. No one is running. No one is guessing. There is no frantic bayonet probing. No soldiers frozen on their bellies feeling centimeter by centimeter through the sand. It looks, from 100 meters away, as if the ground itself has stopped being dangerous for them. The officer lowers his glasses. He has no explanation for what he just watched. And by the next morning, similar reports are already climbing the chain of command from other sectors of the front, patrols crossing fields that should have killed half of them, engineers clearing lanes in a fraction of the time German field manuals said was physically possible. Somewhere inside the United States Army, something had quietly rewritten the math of the battlefield. The question that would haunt German intelligence officers for the rest of the campaign is simple to state and agonizing to answer. What was it? And how long would it take the Wehrmacht to understand the answer before it was already too late to matter? This was not a single lucky night, and it was not one unusually skilled patrol. Over the following 18 months, from the sands outside Kasserine to the volcanic hills of Italy to the hedgerows beyond the Normandy beaches, the same unsettling report would reach German command posts again and again, filed by different officers in different sectors, describing the same impossible thing happening to fields that should have held. Whatever the Americans had figured out, it was not a fluke. It was repeatable, teachable, and it kept working even as German engineers scrambled to close whatever hole they assumed had been found in their defenses. And repeatable, on a battlefield, is the single most dangerous word an enemy can hear about his own methods. To understand why a seasoned German officer was so unsettled by a routine night patrol, you have to go back almost 2 years to a problem that had nothing to do with combat at all. It began as an engineering problem, born in a laboratory in the continental United States, long before a single American soldier fired a shot at a German one. By 1941, the United States Army Corps of Engineers had identified a serious and growing deficiency. Anti-tank mines were becoming the primary defensive weapon of every major army fighting in Europe and North Africa, and American forces had no reliable, fast way to find them once they were buried. The existing method was brutally simple. Engineers crawled forward on their hands and knees and probed the earth ahead of them with bayonets or wooden rods, inch by inch, testing the give of the soil for the telltale resistance of a buried casing. It was excruciatingly slow. A trained team might clear only a narrow lane of a few dozen yards in an entire night, and every minute of that work left soldiers exposed in the open, silhouetted against whatever moonlight or flare light happened to be falling on the field. In a war that increasingly depended on speed, on getting tanks and infantry through a gap before the enemy could react, that kind of pace was close to a death sentence for any offensive timetable. The assignment fell to the Signal Corps, working in coordination with Army engineers. The technology they reached for was not entirely new. Induction balance metal detectors had already been used commercially, mostly in mineral prospecting, for locating buried ore and metallic deposits. What the Army needed was a version rugged enough for a battlefield, light enough for one soldier to carry and operate alone, and reliable enough that a rifle platoon could trust its life to the tone in a set of headphones. Engineers built and rebuilt prototypes through 1941 and into 1942, refining the coil design, the amplifier circuitry, and the battery pack until the unit was finally standardized in September 1942 under its formal designation, Detector Set, SCR 625. The device itself looked almost comically low-tech for something about to change the outcome of battles. A 6-foot wooden exploring rod, a flat, pie-shaped search coil mounted beneath an 18-inch wooden disc at the end, giving it the unmistakable silhouette of a man walking a giant frying pan across the sand. A canvas haversack of dry-cell batteries slung against the operator's hip, wired through a control box, and an amplifier strapped to his chest, feeding finally into a pair of simple earphones. The complete rig weighed about 7.5 pounds. When the search coil passed over a buried metallic object, the magnetic field it generated shifted, and the amplifier translated that shift into an audible hum, a rising tone that told the operator, with no need to dig or guess, that death was sitting somewhere in the dirt directly beneath the disc. It was not glamorous. It was not fast in any absolute sense. But it worked well enough, quickly enough, that by November 1942, barely 2 months after standardization, it was already strapped to the sides of the first American engineers waiting ashore in Morocco as part of Operation Torch. Consider how narrow that window actually was. A piece of equipment this specialized, this dependent on trained operators and delicate vacuum tube electronics, would ordinarily take years to move from laboratory prototype to widespread frontline issue. The Army compressed that timeline into a matter of months, running production and training in parallel rather than in sequence, gambling that soldiers could learn the device well enough under wartime pressure to make it worth fielding at all. It was, in its own quiet way, as much a logistical and educational achievement as it was an engineering one. Thousands of units manufactured, shipped, and distributed to engineer battalions who then had to teach entirely green soldiers, many of whom had never operated anything more complicated than a rifle, to trust a hum in their ears over the evidence of their own eyes. That gamble paid off, but not evenly, and not without early stumbles. The first operators in Tunisia were, by any honest account, still learning the instrument's quirks under live conditions, how humidity affected the tone, how quickly the batteries drained in the desert heat, how a operator's own fatigue after an hour of sweeping could dull his ear to a subtle change in pitch. Some early sweeps missed mines. Some early operators grew frustrated with false alarms and started trusting the machine less than they should have. The device that would eventually unsettle German commanders across an entire theater did not arrive as a finished, perfected weapon. It arrived as a rough tool in the hands of soldiers who were, quite literally, learning to use it while men's lives depended on the lesson. That timing turned out to matter more than almost anyone in Washington realized at the time. North Africa was about to become the first place American and German ground forces fought each other directly. And the first place, a German officer would stand on high ground at night and watch an American mine-clearing team do something no Wehrmacht field manual had ever prepared him to expect. But nobody, on either side, fully understood yet just how much of the German army's entire defensive philosophy was quietly resting on one unstated assumption: that a minefield once laid could not be crossed quickly by an attacking force. That assumption, a century of accepted military wisdom, really, was about to be tested for the first time against an enemy carrying a machine built specifically to break it. German minefield doctrine in North Africa was not improvised, and it was not casual. It was the product of years of hard European combat experience, refined by engineers who approached mine warfare with something close to the precision of a science. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, commanding the Afrika Korps, had learned in the earlier desert battles and in France before that a well-laid minefield could do the tactical work of an entire infantry battalion, stopping tanks cold, funneling advancing infantry into carefully sighted kill zones, and buying the priceless commodity of time for artillery to range in on ground the defender had already measured to the meter. By the time American troops arrived in Tunisia in late 1942, German and Italian forces had already seeded staggering quantities of mines across the desert approaches. This was not scattered, ad hoc mining. German engineering doctrine called for meticulous documentation, formal mine plans recording the exact number, type, and fuse of every device laid, whether it was buried or surface set, how many rows made up the field and how many mines sat in each row, and the name and rank of the officer responsible for the work. Fields stretched for kilometers, mixing anti-tank mines like the Teller mine, a flat, roughly 30-centimeter steel disc packed with around 11 pounds of TNT, powerful enough to blow the track off a Sherman or destroy a lighter vehicle outright, with anti-personnel devices sewn specifically to kill or maim the engineers who would inevitably come to clear a path for the armor behind them. Among the deadliest of those anti-personnel devices was the S-mine, a bounding charge that leapt roughly waist-high out of the ground before detonating, spraying steel balls in every direction. A weapon Allied soldiers would come to know with grim familiarity as the Bouncing Betty. German doctrine assumed something specific, and until now entirely reasonable, that clearing a minefield required time. Hours of it, sometimes an entire night's worth. This assumption was baked into the whole German operational tempo. Commanders positioned artillery batteries to cover their minefields precisely because they expected enemy engineers to be pinned there for a long, predictable window, kneeling, or crawling in the open, feeling blindly for tripwires and buried casings, moving at something close to a geological pace. That expectation had held for the entire war so far. The British, fighting these same German minefields for over a year across the North African desert, had used almost exactly that slow, manual probing method, and had paid the expected price in blood in the fields protecting Rommel's positions before the decisive battle at El Alamein. Everyone on the Axis side of the line had every reason to believe the arithmetic of mine warfare was settled. Minutes of exposure per square yard, hours per lane, and artillery ready to punish anyone who tried to rush it. There was also a deeper layer to German confidence, one built into the mines themselves. A Teller mine required roughly 200 pounds of pressure on its plate before it would fire, enough that infantry could often walk directly over a field unmined for their own weight, while the same ground remained lethal to any vehicle heavier than a man. That distinction mattered enormously to German planners. It meant a minefield didn't have to stop every kind of target. It only had to stop tanks and trucks long enough for artillery and machine guns, already ranged in and waiting, to deal with whatever infantry made it through on foot. The entire defensive system was an interlocking machine, mines, guns, and time, and every part of it depended on the enemy needing hours, not minutes, to find a way through. So when American engineers arrived in Tunisia carrying a tool nobody on the German side had encountered in combat before, the entire German calculation about time, exposure, and artillery coverage was suddenly, invisibly, catastrophically wrong, and no one on the German side of the line yet understood why. The real surprise came later. Not simply that the Americans possessed a new device, but how completely and how quietly it inverted every assumption German commanders had used to design their defenses. Here is where the mystery deepens, because the SCR-625 alone does not fully explain what that German officer was watching from the hillside. The detector was genuinely useful, but it was not magic, and it had real, well-documented weaknesses that should have sharply limited its usefulness in exactly the conditions the fighting was actually happening in. The SCR-625 could reliably locate mines buried 6 to 12 inches below the surface, a bit shallower than the 18 inches engineers had originally hoped for, though acceptable in practice, since very few mines were ever buried deeper than a foot. But it had two serious, documented shortcomings. It was not waterproof, and it was mechanically fragile, prone to breaking down in rain or rough handling. And more critically for the terrain American engineers were about to fight across in North Africa and later mainland Italy. It worked purely by sensing metal, and it produced false readings or fell silent altogether in soil with naturally high iron content. In parts of Italy, this problem became severe enough that operators sometimes could not trust the tone in their headphones at all. There was an even bigger problem waiting for them on the other side of the front line, and it was not an accident. German engineers, already anticipating that Allied forces would eventually field metal detectors, had begun deliberately engineering ways around them. Sometimes this meant simple deception, scattering scrap iron and rusted junk metal through and around a genuine minefield, so that an operator's headphones filled with false alarms and his confidence in the machine eroded mine by mine, hour by hour. Sometimes it meant something more fundamental, an entirely new generation of mines built with minimal metal content from the start. The Schutzen Mine 42, soon simply called the Shoe Mine by Allied troops, was a small anti-personnel device built inside a plain wooden box, its lid hinged over a block of cast TNT, and a simple detonator triggered by nothing more than the weight of a boot. Cheap, fast to manufacture, and in theory close to invisible to an induction coil built to sense metal. Later still, German engineers pushed the concept even further with the Glasmine 43, a mine cast almost entirely from molded glass, designed from the outset to defeat metal detection completely. Picture the actual sensory experience of operating one of these detectors in the field, because it explains why the puzzle facing German intelligence ran deeper than a simple technology gap. The operator walked hunched slightly forward, the wooden disc gliding a few inches above the sand in slow, overlapping arcs, his entire world reduced to a faint electronic hum in his headphones, and the ache building in his forearms from holding a 7.5-pound rod steady for an hour at a stretch. A clean, rising tone meant metal, but it did not mean which metal, and it did not distinguish between a buried teller mine and a rusted ration tin some retreating unit had discarded weeks earlier, or a handful of scrap iron a German engineer had deliberately scattered there the night before specifically to produce that exact false alarm. Every tone had to be treated as real until proven otherwise, which meant every tone cost time, nerve, and the operator's dwindling store of composure. So the puzzle facing that German reconnaissance officer at Kasserine was never simply, how do the Americans have a detector? It was something far more disturbing. How were American patrols moving confidently through mixed fields, conventional metal teller mines, minimal metal shoe mines, decoy scrap iron scattered by German engineers, all buried in unpredictable, iron-rich soil, at a pace, and with a level of confidence that suggested they somehow knew exactly where every single device was buried, when the machine in their hands couldn't possibly have told them that on its own. That wasn't the full explanation. And critically, it was not just about equipment at all. German engineers watching this unfold, when they eventually got the chance to examine a captured or damaged SCR-625 unit, would have understood immediately that the machine itself had clear, exploitable limits. They knew their own countermeasures, the scrap iron decoys, the wooden shoe mine, were sound engineering responses to a metal-detecting instrument. On paper, in a technical assessment, the SCR-625 should have been beatable, its usefulness ground down field by field as low metal mines and deceptive scrap spread across more of the front. And yet the reports kept arriving describing American patrols moving through exactly this kind of contaminated, mixed, deliberately confused ground, without the hesitation, the technical limitations of their equipment should have produced. Something was compensating for the machine's blind spots in a way no purely mechanical analysis of the SCR-625 could explain. The breakthrough the German officer was actually witnessing that night was not one invention. It was the fusion of two things happening at once: a machine in one soldier's hands, and a complete, deliberate rebuild of how the U.S. Army trained and organized the men who carried it into a minefield. The engineer battalions supporting the invasion forces in North Africa did not simply hand a soldier a detector and send him alone into the dark. They built dedicated mine-clearing teams, drilled in a layered, choreographed method that combined the SCR-625 with old-fashioned hand probing, careful visual reading of disturbed earth, and a rehearsed division of labor that had no real precedent at this scale in any army's doctrine. A typical American clearing team worked in a staggered line, each man with a specific, rehearsed job. The lead operator swept the SCR-625 in a slow, deliberate arc a few inches above the ground, calling out tone changes in a low voice to the man immediately behind him. That second soldier marked the confirmed safe path with engineer tape, thin strips of white cloth visible even in poor light, laying down a corridor the rest of the patrol could follow without a second thought. Behind the tape, a third soldier probed by hand at a shallow, careful angle, a technique refined specifically to catch the wooden-cased mines the detector might miss entirely, feeling not for a metallic signal, but for the subtle, distinct resistance of a buried box beneath undisturbed soil. This is the detail that made the whole system work, and it is precisely the detail German intelligence had not yet pieced together in early 1943. American engineers were never relying on the machine to catch everything by itself. They were running a genuine hybrid process, machine and human senses operating in the same pass, each one covering the other's blind spot. Where the detector went quiet in iron-heavy soil, or hummed over nothing but a piece of German scrap iron deception, the prober's hand found the tension of a hidden tripwire, or the telltale give of packed earth over a wooden case. Where hand probing alone would have taken agonizing minutes per square yard across an entire field, the detector let the team move past enormous stretches of genuinely empty ground at something close to a walking pace, saving the slow, meticulous work only for the exact spots where the tone in the headphones actually changed. The result was a clearing rate that had no real precedent in German battlefield experience. A lane that would have taken an old-style probing team the better part of a night could, under the right conditions, be opened in a fraction of that time, fast enough that the artillery a German commander had carefully positioned to punish engineers exposed for hours was instead firing, uselessly, on an empty stretch of desert, because the Americans were already through the field and moving on. This created an even larger problem for German commanders than any single crossed minefield. If the enemy could clear lanes fast enough to move infantry and armor through, before defensive artillery could properly range in and react, then the entire underlying logic of the static minefield as a time-buying weapon began to collapse. The minefield was no longer slowing anyone down long enough to matter tactically, and an army whose entire defensive geometry assumes it has hours to react does not function well when the enemy is suddenly operating on a timetable measured in minutes. This layered method did not spring into existence fully formed. It was built the way most effective battlefield doctrine actually gets built, through repetition, failure, correction, and a slow accumulation of small lessons that eventually hardened into standard practice. Engineer officers running after-action reviews in Tunisia noted which teams cleared lanes fastest and which teams suffered casualties, then fed those observations back into how the next rotation of soldiers was trained before they ever reached the front. A technique that worked well in one sector's soil might fail in another's, and units learned to adjust their probing angle, their spacing, even the pace of their sweep, based on the specific ground they expected to cross that night. None of this was written down in a single triumphant field manual handed out to every soldier. It accumulated, unit by unit, sergeant to private, in the particular oral tradition way that frontline soldiers pass hard-won survival knowledge to the men replacing their casualties. History has quietly missed one crucial detail buried in this story for decades. The SCR 625 gets remembered, understandably, as the hero piece of equipment. But the American soldiers who actually did this work, in later accounts, consistently insisted the real advantage wasn't the machine at all. It was the drill. The rehearsed, almost musical coordination between the man with the detector and the man with his bare hands feeling the dirt right behind him. Equipment won individual crossings. Training repeated and refined across an entire theater of war, won campaigns. By mid-1943, the pattern German officers had first found so baffling at Kasserine was no longer a private mystery to be puzzled over quietly on a hillside. It had become a problem serious enough to generate documented, deliberate countermeasures at the highest levels of German engineering command. German forces accelerated their shift toward low-metal and non-metallic mines, wherever wood, glass, and manufacturing capacity allowed, precisely because after-action reports made clear that American detector and probe teams were defeating conventional metallic minefields faster than any German doctrine had anticipated. In Italy, this deliberate countermeasure combined with genuinely difficult, iron-rich volcanic soil to create real, documented trouble for the SCR 625's reliability. The same operators who had performed so effectively across the North African desert now faced a device that hummed unpredictably in their ears, sometimes missing what it should have caught, sometimes crying wolf over nothing but the mineral content of the ground itself. This is the part of the story documentaries rarely tell with full honesty. The American system did not remain unbeatable. It was countered, and it adapted again in response. A genuine, real-time arms race conducted not behind the closed doors of a laboratory, but in the mud, between opposing engineer corps who were, in a strange and largely invisible way, holding a running technical conversation with each other through the medium of exploding ordnance. Neither side ever fully closed the gap on the other for good. What actually happened was closer to a slow ratchet, American teams found a workaround, German engineers found a partial counter. American teams adjusted their drill again, and the whole cycle repeated itself across a dozen different sectors of front, in 3 different countries, over roughly 2 years of continuous contact. American units responded by leaning even harder into the hybrid method that had made them effective in the first place, trusting hand probing more heavily in sectors already known to be iron-rich, and training soldiers to read the subtle visual signs of disturbed soil that betrayed a buried Schuman's wooden box, even when the detector in their ears said nothing was there. Soldiers who did this work described it bluntly, without any romance, in later accounts. It was exhausting. Standing upright and sweeping a 7.5-pound rod back and forth for hours punished the arms, the shoulders, and the lower back. Men disliked how exposed they felt doing it even on the rare stretches when small arms fire wasn't directly aimed at them, because the posture the work demanded, standing, moving slowly, visible, went against every survival instinct infantry combat had already trained into them. It was slow, repetitive, physically brutal work that demanded total, unbroken concentration, because a single missed tone or one rushed, careless probe meant the man walking a few feet behind might step on a teller mine, or a shoe mine that the entire painstaking process had somehow failed to catch. The cost of that concentration was real, and it never fully went away no matter how well drilled a team became. A single momentary lapse, a tired arm letting the disc drift an inch too high off the ground, a probe angled a few degrees too steep, a soldier trusting silence in his headphones over the sight of slightly disturbed earth, could and did kill. Engineer units in North Africa and Italy carried these losses quietly, the way specialists in dangerous, unglamorous work often do, without much public recognition, because a mine-clearing team's successes were measured in an absence. The absence of an explosion, the absence of a casualty report, the absence of anything dramatic enough to make headlines back home. Their failures, by contrast, were loud, immediate, and permanent. And still, despite the fatigue, despite the German countermeasures, despite the genuinely difficult terrain of Sicily, and then mainland Italy, American clearing teams kept opening lanes that German commanders had not expected to be opened, and kept doing it faster than German planning assumed was possible. Reports continued moving up the German chain of command describing what amounted to the same disturbing phenomenon first witnessed at Kasserine. Infantry and armor pushing through ground that should have cost the attacker heavy casualties and hours of delay, doing so instead in a fraction of the anticipated time, again and again, on different ground, against different German units, all reporting the same impossible thing. The final piece of the puzzle, the piece that actually answers the question that German officer was silently asking himself on that hillside above Kasserine Pass, is not a single device, and it is not a single clever tactic. It is that the United States Army had, almost without German intelligence fully registering it was even happening, industrialized a process that the rest of the war's major armies still treated as a slow, artisanal craft, passed down informally between a handful of gifted engineer sergeants. Detector production scaled up, Training pipelines standardized the drill across multiple theaters at once. What had briefly been the isolated skill of a few talented individuals became a repeatable, teachable system, fielded by thousands of soldiers across North Africa, then Sicily, then mainland Italy, and eventually into France after the Normandy landings, where Army engineers were still photographed sweeping the very same model of SCR 625 units across French soil in July 1944, more than a year and a half after that first bewildering, silent night in the Tunisian desert. By then, German forces defending the Atlantic Wall had planted an almost unimaginable number of mines of their own, well over 6 million devices sown across northern France alone, laid in staggered rows running as deep as 500 yards behind the coastline. And American and British engineers were still finding, minefield by minefield, that the same layered method born in the sand outside Kasserine kept working, kept opening lanes, kept moving armies forward faster than German defensive planning could adjust to. The answer had been sitting in plain sight the entire time, waiting for anyone on the other side of the line to notice it. Not a secret weapon, a system, machine, method, and rehearsal, all moving together, faster than the doctrine built to stop them could ever manage to adjust. Return, for a moment, to that hillside above Kasserine Pass. The German reconnaissance officer, field glasses lowered, still watching the last of the American patrol vanish into the dark on the far side of a minefield his own engineers had laid with such exacting, documented care. He was not wrong to feel unsettled. He was watching, in real time, the opening moves of a shift that would define how mechanized armies fought defensive terrain for the rest of the war and long after it ended. He had no way of knowing that the flat wooden disc one American soldier carried on a 6-foot rod was the product of a laboratory decision made barely a year earlier, standardized in September 1942, and rushed into the hands of green troops landing in Morocco with only 2 months to train on it before they were using it under fire. He had no way of knowing that the real secret was never the hum in a soldier's headphones alone. It was the drilled, rehearsed partnership between that hum and the bare hand of the man probing the earth right behind him. A system built to cover its own weaknesses before the enemy ever found a way to exploit them. What the officer sensed correctly that night, even without understanding the mechanism behind it, was that something fundamental had changed beneath his feet, quite literally. The minefield, for a century, one of the most reliable tools any defending army possessed, had just stopped buying the time it was designed to buy. An army that doesn't understand why the ground beneath its own defenses has turned against it is an army that has already lost an argument it doesn't yet know it's having, even with years of fighting still ahead of it. That is the quiet, unglamorous truth behind one of the most disorienting tactical surprises of the North African campaign, one that would echo forward through Sicily, Italy, and finally the beaches and hedgerows of France. It wasn't a secret weapon that beat the German minefields. It was 7.5 pounds of wood, wire, and battery, carried by an exhausted soldier who had walked that exact rehearsal 100 times before he ever had to do it for real, under fire in the dark. There is a broader lesson in that hillside scene, one that extends well past a single night outside Kasserine Pass. Militaries lose ground not only when an enemy invents something they cannot counter, but when an enemy quietly turns a slow, artisanal skill into a fast, teachable system before the other side notices the shift has even happened. The Wehrmacht eventually did adapt. The wooden shoe mine and the glass-bodied Glasmine 43 were real, effective responses, not desperate improvisation. But by the time those countermeasures reached the front in meaningful numbers, American engineer battalions had already folded a new probing technique into their drill and kept moving. The contest was never a single moment of discovery. It was a running conversation, fought in silence, in the dark, in the dirt, between two engineering traditions that never spoke to each other directly and never needed to. Each side read the other's intentions purely through the evidence left behind in cleared lanes and undetonated fields, and each side adjusted, and adjusted again, for as long as the war demanded it of them. The German officer on that hillside above Kasserine Pass never learned the soldier's name who led that patrol through his minefield. He never got the chance to ask him how it was done. All he had, in the end, was the unresolved unease of watching an impossible thing happen twice, then a third time, then enough times that impossible stopped being the right word for it at all, and the slow, dawning, unwelcome realization that the ground his army had trusted to hold the line was no longer holding anything at all.